Year 7, welcome to your next lesson on medieval monarchs. This is lesson 5 and I am Miss Stevenson here with you today. So the first thing you need to do is your low stakes quiz, your short quiz to check what you learned in your last lesson. So when I tell you to, you're going to pause the video, click the link in the video description to bring up your quiz, complete your quiz and then submit and check your answers. So if you pause your video now. Okay, so we're still looking at this inquiry question. Why did Dan Jones argue that medieval monarchy was founded on a paradox? And remember, a paradox means like a contradiction. On the one hand, medieval monarchs were supposed to be the supreme authority, but on the other hand, actually, if they didn't live up to expectations, they could find themselves having their power restricted or even taken off the throne. Last lesson, we looked at King John, who was not really a very successful king, and the barons restricted his power. They made him sign the Magna Carta, which said that he couldn't tax the barons as much as he wanted to, and that actually he didn't have as much control over the church as he wanted to. And the king himself signed that, taking away some of his power, showing us this paradox that Dan Jones is talking about. Now today, we're going to be looking at whether ordinary people could challenge the power of the king. Last lesson we saw that the barons could. This lesson we're going to see if ordinary people could. So we're going to describe the events of the Peasants Revolt, explain the causes of the Peasants Revolt, and make inferences from the story of the Peasants Revolt about the power of medieval monarchs. So if you can pause your video to write your title. Hey, welcome back. We just want to think about this question: why might peasants want to challenge the power of the king? And this is a bit of a recap. You might remember back when we learned about the Normans, we learned about the feudal system, the hierarchy of society, where the king was at the top, and he granted the barons land, who then lent the knights some land, and they then made the peasants work on their land. And so the peasants worked really hard farming and gave food to the knights. The knights, in return for the land they got from the barons, they would fight for the barons when they needed to, and the barons, in return for the land they got from the king, would fight for the king when they needed to. But in this feudal system, most of the time it was the peasants doing the work and making the food, but the peasants did not really have any of the wealth. So the Peasants Revolt in 1381. So in the year 1381, the peasants rebelled against kind of the king and society. Why did they rebel? Well, the first reason is to do with like freedom and equality. Thinking about the feudal system, the peasants didn't really have a choice what they did. If the peasants said, I don't want to be a farmer, tough luck. They had to work on the land that they were told to work on and provide the food that they were told to provide to the knights. So they worked really hard farming day after day, creating all of the food in England, and yet they had none of the money. So they had very little wealth. All the wealth, all the food went back up the feudal system. And so this man here, he's a priest. He's called John Bull. He saw this system and he saw this lack of equality that the peasants had. And he said, this really isn't fair. And he began preaching and going around and talking to peasants. And this began to give peasants like the idea that, yeah, it wasn't fair. And maybe they didn't have to live in this unfair society forever. So we're going to do some true or false questions. You know how this works. I just want you to write T or F in your book along with the number. And then if it's false, I want you to put in the correct answer. In medieval England, knights did all the farming. Pause your video and write your answer. This is false. The peasants did all the farming. Question 2. Peasants in medieval England were rich. Pause and write your answer. This is false. Peasants in medieval England were poor. Question 3. The priest John Bull told peasants that they should have equality. Pause and write your answer. This one is true. This was radical, as it was saying peasants should be the same as barons and knights. Pause and write your answer. This is true. It was incredibly radical. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to turn these fragments into full sentences. So remember, the fragment might be at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the sentence, and you have to put the words into the sentence in the same order that I put them here. So fragment number 1, were not equal. If you can pause and write your answer, please. I've put medieval peasants were not equal in power or wealth to barons and knights. Fragment 2, Bull said that. Who was Bull and what did he say? Pause and write your answer. So I've written, the priest John Bull said that peasants should have equality with barons and knights. Rebelled because. Why does this mean that the peasants rebelled? Pause and write your answer. Therefore, the peasants rebelled because they wanted equality. Well done if you got all of those correct. You might have put something slightly different, but so long as it means roughly the same thing, that is fine. So, now we're going to look at another reason that the peasants rebelled in 1381. Now, in 1348, a terrible disease hit England, a disease called the Black Death. And this was a deadly disease that killed most of the people, really, who caught it. 50%, around about, not exactly, of the people living in England died. And this had a huge impact that had a lasting impact into the 1380s. So many people died that actually the peasants who were supposed to be farming the fields and providing the food, actually there weren't enough peasants to work anymore. And this had a real impact because it gave the peasants who hadn't died power. Because they were able to say to the people employing them, well, you're going to have to pay me more if you want me to work. Because if I don't work, there's no other peasants around to work on your fields, and so you won't get any food. And so it gave the peasants like a taste of power. Now, this taste of power didn't last long. The king and the barons brought in laws trying to limit the amount of money that peasants could be paid. But it gave peasants confidence that actually they should be getting more for what they were doing. What we're going to do now is some true or false questions just to see how much you remember. Remember, you write T or F, but if you think it's false, you need to write the correct answer. In 1348, the Black Death struck England. Pause your video. This is true. Black Death was a deadly disease. Pause your video. This is also true. 10% of England's population died in the Black Death. This is false. It was about 50%. This meant there were too many peasants to farm the fields. Pause your video. This is false. It meant there weren't enough peasants to farm the fields. Peasants were able to ask for more money for their work. Pause your video. This is true. The king and barons made laws limiting the amount of money peasants could get paid. This is true. So now what we're going to do is some fragments. We're going to turn these fragments into full sentences. Fragment number 1. A deadly disease killed. If you can turn this into a sentence for me, please. Welcome back. So I've written the Black Death, a deadly disease, killed around 50% of England's population. The next one, not enough peasants to. What weren't there enough peasants to do? Pause your video. Welcome back. So I've written, this meant that there were not enough peasants to farm all the fields, or you might have put to grow all the food, or to work for the barons. Could demand higher. Pause your video and turn this one into a sentence for me, please. As a result, peasants could demand higher wages from the knights and the barons. Well done if you got all of those correct. So we're going to look at another reason why the peasants rebelled in 1381. And this is to do with tax, money that the government and the king get people to pay. Now, in 1381, the government introduced a third poll tax in not very many years. Now, a poll tax is a type of tax where every single person paid the same amount of money. So a peasant paid the same amount of money as a baron, even though a baron was far richer than a peasant. Now, the peasants, they thought this was really unfair because they had nowhere near as much money as the knights and barons, so they didn't think they should pay the same amount. And this is kind of what triggered them to rebel because they were angry about this tax. So, true or false in your book? Remember, you just need to write T or F. If it's false, you need to write the correct answer. In 1381, the government asked for a third poll tax. Pause your video. This is true. A poll tax is a tax that everyone pays, but how much you pay depends on your wealth. Pause your video. This one is false. It means everyone paid the same amount. The peasant said the poll tax was unfair as each peasant paid the same amount as a baron. Pause your video. This is true. And this made the peasants rebel as it seemed very unfair. Pause your video. This one is true as well. So, we're going to turn these fragments into full sentences. Fragment number 1, the third. Pause your video, write your sentence. In 1381, the government introduced the third poll tax. Everyone paid. Let's turn this into a sentence. If We pause our video. Welcome back. So I've written, a poll tax meant that everyone paid the same amount no matter how rich or poor you were. Rebel because. Pause your video and turn that into a sentence, please. So I've written, this made the peasants rebel because they did not think that it was fair that they had to pay the same amount as a baron. Okay, super. Well done if you got all of those. What we're going to do now is we're going to see what happened in the Peasants Revolt. Now, in the Peasants Revolt in 1381, 50,000 peasants marched to London. And they stopped just outside London and made a camp. Now, the king at the time was called Richard II. He was only 14, a little bit older than you. And he sailed down the River London on his barge and he got off to meet the peasants. But then he saw the huge crowd of 50,000 peasants and he turned and sailed away. He thought, I don't want to deal with this many people. Richard coming to see them and then turning away and leaving them angered the peasants. And so they broke into the city of London and they killed one of the king's advisors, Sir Richard Hales, and they killed the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important Christian in England. So these people died. So Richard decided to go and meet the peasants' leader after they had gone around killing the Archbishop. And so the peasants' leader was called Wat Tyler, and they met just outside of London. Now, when he was there with the crowd and Wat Tyler, King Richard said, I agree to the Magna Carta. He agreed that he would make everyone equal and he would stick to the Magna Carta and life was going to be wonderful. Yet, Wat Tyler was then stabbed and killed by one of King Richard's officials. Richard then turned to the 50,000 peasants and said, guys, go home. And they went home. Richard said to them, you shall have no captain but me, which basically means I am the supreme authority. And once the peasants had all gone home, Richard definitely went back on his word. He did not give the peasants equality. He did not really stick to the Magna Carta, and he had the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt executed, except for Wat Tyler, who was already dead. Okay, so what we're going to do now is some true or false questions. Just T or F in your book. Remember, if it's false, you need to write the correct answer. Question 1. In 1381, 50,000 barons rebelled. True or false? Pause your video. This is false. It was 50,000 peasants. Question 2. The peasants marched to London and camped outside it. True or false? Pause your video. This is true. Question 3. The 14-year-old King Richard II quickly fled, that means he ran away, from London. True or false? Pause your video. This one is false. He went to meet the peasants, but seeing the size of the crowd, then he left. Question 4. The peasants attacked London and killed Richard's advisor and the Archbishop. True or false? Pause your video. This one's true. Question 5. Richard refused to meet the peasants. I mean, they had been very bad. True or false? Pause your video. This one is false. He met the peasants and agreed to make all men equal. Question 6. The peasants' leader, Wat Tyler, was stabbed and killed. True or false? Pause your video. This one is true. The peasants all went home. True or false? Pause your video. This one is also true. And finally, Richard kept his word and made peasants, knights and barons equal to each other. Pause your video. This one is false. He went back on his word and he executed the leaders. Okay, what we're going to do now is some final fragments. You're going to turn these 3 fragments into sentences for me. So our first one, 50,000 peasants. If you pause your video and turn that into a fragment for me, sentence for me. I've put in 1381, 50,000 peasants rebelled and marched to London. Now you might have just put 50,000 peasants rebelled, but it's better if you can tell me the year and just kind of where it happened. 14-year-old king. Pause your video and turn this into a sentence. The 14-year-old King Richard II met the peasants and agreed to their demands for equality. Okay, and our final one, went back on his. Who went back on their something? Pause your video, write your sentence. Richard went back on his word and did not create equality and had the peasants' leaders executed. Okay, well done if you've got 3 good sentences for those fragments. And so what I just want us to think about is what happened in the Peasants' Revolt. Let's go over the story again. So, first of all, I want you to pause and see how much of you can remember using these pictures. Okay, welcome back. So the Peasants' Revolt, 50,000 peasants rebelled and marched to London. King Richard sailed to meet them, but he didn't want to see them, so then he turned his boat around and sailed away. This made the peasants angry. They attacked London and they killed Richard's advisor and the Archbishop of Canterbury. This made Richard kind of think he had to go and meet the peasants. So he went and met the peasants and kind of said to them, "Sure, I agree to your demands." However, when he met their leader, Wat Tyler ended up getting stabbed. Richard then turned to the peasants and said, "You have no captain but me," and kind of sent all of the peasants home, and they obeyed. And then Richard had the leaders of the rebellion executed. So let's have a think about this. We're going to be thinking about what the Peasants' Revolt tells us about the power of the king. So if we think about it, we can see that actually, if we look at who they killed, the peasants probably weren't angry with the king. They were angry with his advisors who were suggesting that he brought in the poll tax. And if we think about the peasants' behaviour, although Richard really was the one introducing these laws and making their lives a bit rubbish, actually the peasants very quickly forgave Richard and kind of just wanted him to say that he would treat them okay. And so maybe this shows us that the power of the king, that actually the people of England really believed in the power of the king and they wanted their king. And even if he wasn't perfect, they didn't want to blame him. They would rather blame other people. And so if we go back to our question about Dan Jones and medieval monarchy being founded on a paradox, we kind of have this situation where Richard II, he was only 14. He shouldn't have really had the power to be the supreme authority. And actually we can see that maybe people kind of thought he didn't because they challenged him. However, when he actually went to go and meet them and meet the peasants, it kind of made the peasants think he was brave enough, he was the supreme authority. And actually, even though he'd done things wrong, they wanted him to be their leader. So that's all we're going to do today. Now we're going to have a quick look at our exit ticket, a short quiz to check what you've understood from today's lesson. So when I tell you to, you're going to pause the video, click the link in the video description to bring up your quiz, complete your quiz, and then submit and check your answers. Really well done for your work today, Year 7, and if you can pause your video now.